Welcome.
Hi Dad, how's it going?
It's going okay.
Great to see you. Did you get out and about this morning?
Pardon?
Did you? On the 18th of February 2020, I received a call from my father, Juliusz Kessling, to tell me that his condition had deteriorated and he had just 2 to 4 months left to live. He'd been living with bowel cancer for over 2 years and had dealt with it remarkably, with courage, fortitude and a continued zest for life. But he knew the end was near. My dad was born on the 8th of July 1939, at the dawn of the Second World War. He lived through the Warsaw uprising in 1944 until he escaped with his mother and eventually came to England. As a child and as an adult, I'd heard many stories about his life as a child in Poland and had discussed with him recording his recollections. Now it seemed more important than ever to do this, so on the 19th of February, I went to his house in Surrey to record what he had to say. My father actually outlived the 2 to 4 month prediction and died at the age of 81 on the 28th of August 2020. In his own words, this is his story of his early life. Remembered, but in your words. So I'm just going to ask you a few questions about that. I'm not trying to structure this like an interview.
Well, I'm glad you are structuring it like an interview, right, because it makes life so much easier.
Okay. Well, I'll prompt you along then.
Yeah. Okay.
But really, you were born on the 8th of July 1939.
That's it.
Yeah. So right, really, at the beginning of the Second World War.
Yeah. Well, 3 months before the start.
3 months before the start.
Yeah.
And certainly I can recall you really talking about some things that you remember with crystal clarity as to what happened in Poland. Yeah. So just as a sort of a few general things, where exactly were you born?
I was born in the Hospital of the Child Jesus in Warsaw.
In Warsaw?
Yes.
And is that right in the heart of Warsaw?
That's right well, I don't know, but I imagine because Daddy was an officer and a gentleman, it would be right in the heart of Warsaw.
Yeah. And just talking about your mum and dad, your mum was, what was her name?
Wanda Kraszka.
And your dad's name?
Wacław Kessling.
And what were at that particular stage? What were their occupations? What did they do for their work?
Father had qualified as a doctor in 1933, and mother was still she was 7 years younger than him, and she was still in her final year as a medical student.
And what did she go on to do?
What did she go on to do?
Yeah, as her profession in due course.
Well, she was a dentist.
A dentist, yeah.
So she was in final years, not as medical school, in dental school.
Okay. Cool.
In fact, she passed her exams but didn't get her certificate. And she had a real problem at the end of the war because she didn't have this medical, her graduation certificate.
Was that because of the outbreak of the Second World War?
Well, because of because I was born, and because she was looking after baby, she didn't have time to go and collect her.
Oh, I see.
She didn't go to the graduation ceremony.
Right. Okay. So she had to deal with that bureaucracy
after the war.
Okay. Right. Not easy. And also, just as a matter of context and background, you were the first of 4 children.
First of 4 children.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's you, Julius.
Yeah.
Then came along Elizabeth.
And then a year later came Richard.
Then Richard.
And 15 years after my birth was Anna.
Okay. So Anna's the baby.
Died. Pardon?
Anna's the baby of the family.
Anna's baby of the family.
Richard's the middle child. And I say
that's
middle
right.
child. Yeah. He's just turned 70.
Yeah.
And that's because Elizabeth died.
Elizabeth died, yeah.
And she died in London.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't remember, but it was either 52, 53, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So, going right back to the beginning, what are your first memories of Poland? What's the first thing that jumped into your mind?
Um, I had this at the tip of my tongue the other day, but now I've forgotten. It was we had what's at that time seemed to me a big garden with a sandpit under a Morello cherry tree, and the big sandpit was at the gate. The whole property was had a wire fence around it. It felt like 2 meters high, and probably was quite high. And I lived in that house with my grandmother, my grandfather, who it was his house, and my auntie Regina and her son Mark. Her husband had been killed in Katyn, where all the Polish officers had been murdered by the Russians, and he was he was a flying officer, but I think he was either a gunner or something technical on an aeroplane rather than a pilot. And anyway, he was caught by the Russians and arrested. Father, funnily enough, in 1939, when he crossed Poland, actually met him, and he said, "We're all gathering in the next village along from where you are, called Katyn. That's where all the officers are going. You should come with us." And Father said, "Well, I'm at the barracks and I'm trying to organize my troops." But he only had his troops were probably 12 men at the most, because there were 3 field ambulances and probably there were 2 men per ambulance.
Yeah.
So he had a very small group. But he was totally unkeen of going into a lager with all the other officers and gentlemen. Well, so as long as he could wangle his way out, he stayed out. So I'm deviating anyway. And that's why they.
So that saved him.
That saved him, yes, because the Russians accused him of being a saboteur and threw him into prison. Well, not as they accused him of being a socially undesirable.
This is your
element.
dad?
Yes.
Yeah.
Socially undesirable element.
So he ended up in one of the gulag camps.
He went up into the gulags.
Okay.
But what I remember of Poland was the garden, and outside the garden we used to have an elderly German who had a gun and a helmet and an ill-fitting uniform, who used to plod up and down our street. And he did it at very regular times. So Mark, my cousin, and I used to wait for him, and he would march on one side of the fence, and we would join him and march with him on the other side of the fence. And this was very special. So we kept guard over him.
So these are your really early...
This is before the Warsaw uprising, somewhere. I was still wearing a bib over my clothes, so I had, a shirt and trousers, and I knew, and it was summer.
Yeah.
And I was wearing a bib, not because I was drooling, but presumably because I was.
Because you needed one. So the war must have had a tremendous impact.
At that time, no. I had a doting grandmother and a doting mum and a doting aunt, and me and Mark were like joined at the hip. So we had a lovely time. We had a garden.
And Mark was the same age as you?
Mark was the same age as me, and I think he was about 3 to 6 months older than me. He was one of these blokes who had, with utter charm, and women loved him, even as a 3-year-old, and he was outrageously good at being loved. And I suppose in some ways I was his satellite. But we had just, between the sand castles and the gardens, we had a secret. We had tapeworms. Not tapeworms, we had little white, little wiggly white worms. And we used to go into the not blackberries, what are these little blackcurrant?
Blackcurrants, yeah.
Blackcurrant patch. And we'd do poo, and we'd count each other's worms.
Yeah, I mean, just the sort of things that kids love. Yeah,
Yes,
I think. So
it was our secret.
probably a good thing. So the war, because of your age and your environment and the care you're receiving, didn't have an immediate impact.
No, I knew my father had gone off to war, and I knew Mark's father had gone off to war, and we had their hats. And apparently, I can't remember this, but my mother said on one occasion we managed to filch father's military hat, and that these were Polish uniforms were banned. So the fact that they'd kept them as souvenirs was a crime in its own right.
Right, okay.
So, but we put them on, and with this German in his helmet, and I had my kepi, and Mark, his father's forage cap. So we joined this German walking slowly up and down, and we walked in our uniforms up and down with him, carrying little sticks just to make sure that he had.
So when did the war actually have an impact? When did this change?
It had an impact on me. My mother had bought me a pair of boots, and leather boots were not accepted. There was gigantic shortages, so she bought me a pair of children's felt boots.
What, suede or
felt?
Felt. Right, okay.
Leather bottom or rubber bottom,
yeah,
and a felt top.
Okay.
But so, and they went up to below the knee, of which I was very proud.
Yeah.
And we were going into town, and we were living in a part of Warsaw on the east bank called the Grochów, where there was a tram, and our bus stop was 2 stops from the end where the tram turned round. And it was a lovely day when, I don't know, when do potatoes come into flower? Because at the end of our street was the main road, Grochowska, whatever it was called. And because it was such a nice day, we turned round and walked away from Warsaw to the next bus stop, which was beside a field of potatoes. And there was a light breeze because the potato flowers were wafting in the breeze. And the potatoes had been, made into mounds. So there was a sort of mound with potatoes growing from the top, and a trough in the next mound. And we're standing at the bus stop, and this German armoured car came along. And in the top of it were 3 blokes, and they were laughing and having a great time, and they looked, full of sunshine and joy. And we were standing in a line at this tram stop, and suddenly they turned their machine gun onto us and started firing. And my mother dived on top of me in between the mounds of potatoes, and the bullets were whistling through the flowers and cutting the flowers. And when I got up, and they just drove on and carried on laughing as if nothing had happened. They just thought it was real funny. And we brushed it. I don't know what happened to the other people, but I remember when we stood up and brushed all this earth off, my beautiful white felt boots were covered in mud and stained. And that's what made me hate Germans. I mean, just there was a personal vendetta. So
is there something?
That's the washing machine. That's the laundry machine. Dishwasher.
Can I turn it off?
I don't know how, but you can.
Let me just pause this for a moment. So that's what made you hate the Germans?
Made me hate the Germans. Yes, I had very sort of visceral.
Yeah.
And this dichotomy between the machine gun firing and these people laughing, and they were just obscene. I must have been, 44, I'd have been 5. So this must have been presumably spring of 44, before the Warsaw uprising. And after that, I remember going into Warsaw, and near some official building, there were these gigantic flags hanging from the first floor balcony. And there was just, 4 meters high. And they were attached on poles which had been projecting from the balcony. But between the flags, there were men who'd been hung on ropes. So there was a flag, German flag, a dead pole flag. And I said, Mum, look at those. And she sort of grabbed my head and put her hand over my eyes and tried to prevent me seeing anything. And I think they tried very hard all the time to protect us from seeing any of the horrors.
And your dad was away?
And Dad was in a gulag in Siberia.
Already by this stage?
39 he went into. And this must have been for either spring of 44.
Because he was in the Polish cavalry, wasn't he?
He started off in the Polish cavalry and then was transferred to the artillery, and then he was transferred to the a regiment which was a border regiment, but he was part of the medical corps by that time, rather than being seconded to a regiment.
Okay. So,
but he did have a horse. In fact, he had 2 horses and a groom,
right,
and a batman, as a gentleman does.
So after the experience of seeing these hanged men between the
it was just a second's worth of seeing bodies.
What's the next sort of war experience that you can particularly recall? Was that after, or can you remember the beginning of the Warsaw uprising, for example?
Oh yes, but because this came later. This was before the Warsaw uprising.
Yeah.
Every time the German was shot, they would go into the street and grab 10, 20 people and hang them. And so...
what can you recall about the start of the Warsaw uprising?
That was the start of the Warsaw. We'd been given 24 hours notice of the start of the Warsaw uprising. And so my mother ordered a wagon because Poles weren't allowed to use motor cars. And we had an aunt who lived on the west side of Warsaw. And the reason for moving there was because on a farm there is always much more food than if you're not on a farm. In my grandfather's house, we grew our own vegetables. And we tried growing rabbits. Or we had rabbits occasionally. Because I think, but that was about the only food that we had, which was, which we grew ourselves. But on a farm they had pigs and all the rest of it. Having said that, you were not allowed to kill a pig under pain of being thrown in jail or being beaten up, because food was strictly very controlled. And if you had, I think, more than a kilo of meat on you or half a kilo of meat, you got beaten up or arrested and fined. Or arrested, fined and beaten up and your food confiscated. So,
So would they regularly inspect, would the Germans regularly inspect the farm?
Every farm and every smallholder was inspected. And they used the local police rather than... But it was very strictly and methodically organised.
And the local police were Poles?
Poles,
yeah. So you were talking about the 24 hours notice and that your mum...
Yeah, so we got a wagon.
Yeah.
And she loaded up bedding and, my aunt, my grandmother, Mark and myself. And off we trundled. And I remember crossing the Vistula and thinking how mad it was, because all these, on the side of the road, were all these German tankettes or armoured cars with guns on top. But they all had they were covered in leaves and branches. And I thought, how crazy is it to camouflage yourself on a bridge with leaves and branches? But anyway, they were.
Yeah.
And so we crossed over. And before that, the Germans were in retreat. And there were people called Volksdeutsch, people who had German ancestry. And for some reason, an awful lot of them used to wear these German leather trousers, whose name I've forgotten at the moment, with bibs, and they've got a special name.
Yeah.
And little Tyrolean hats that went with it.
Like sort of lederhosen.
Lederhosen,
yeah.
Yes, the word.
Yeah.
And I remember these... and the retreating Germans, yes, there was the army retreating, but also civilians who were there. And they were driving in carts and not coaches, but, landaus or whatever these horse-drawn vehicles were called, with all their goods and chattels. And a lot of them were dressed in lederhosen, which I found quite remarkable. Or perhaps they weren't all, but I the ones that I remembered. I used to go, this before the war, I used to go to a kindergarten. And to go to kindergarten, we had to go by tram. And behind the tram, there were some German soldiers riding on their bicycles. And so I turned round and went, Pichoo! And he went, Pichoo! At me. And we were having a great game, and my mother went into total hysterics because she was just waiting for the moment he would pull his gun out.
Yeah.
Couldn't understand why. But again, that was summertime, and the Warsaw uprising started in September. So it must have been something like June, July.
Mm.
And that's a by and by. But anyway, going back to the Warsaw, we get over the river nicely, and a wheel falls off the cart. So my mother had a dental surgery in Warsaw. So she said, never mind, we'll spend the night in the surgery and the carter will come back tomorrow and, repair his cart. And of course he never came back because the Warsaw uprising started. So we were left sitting in mother's surgery with no food and no bedding and no, because everything had been left on the cart. Perhaps we might have, I can't remember whether we took any. Must have taken a duvet or something to sleep. But, and that's how the Warsaw Uprising started for us.
And was it obvious to you that it had started?
Yes, because once we went into the surgery and sort of sorted ourselves out there a little bit. Mother's dental surgery. We went for a walk and suddenly there was this sort of rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat noises and crumps. And there's a huge, big purple cloud of either an explosion or something burning. But there was this enormous purple cloud. And we knew that things had started. So we went back to her surgery. And that was the start of the Warsaw Uprising.
Did you ever return home to what you'd known as home?
Oh, you couldn't because the bridges had been blocked. So we only returned back home after grandmother had died and my aunt had been smashed up and Mark had died. So we returned after the end of the Warsaw Uprising, more or less when the Russians had succeeded in pushing the Germans way past Warsaw.
So where did you stay and what happened during your Warsaw Uprising experience, if I could put it like that?
Well, it all jumbled up, but basically we moved from place to place. We kept on trying to find somewhere safe, and wherever you went, it sooner or later became unsafe. So it's all flashes of memory rather than continuous, logical narrative. And I used to try to talk to my father about it, and he said, well, that's not how mother remembers it. He was quite happy telling me about his war, but he really didn't want to know about my war. And that's what his answer was, well, that's not how mother remembers it.
Why didn't he want to know about your war?
You'd have to ask him. But I think there was no therapy of any kind, and he tried to formulate his stories that they had some sort of moral purpose in them, or at least something edifying. And my stories were just a little boy's stories. And probably they were different from my mother because her point of view was up here and my point of view was down there. I remember my grandfather's house. Yes, it was a 3-room house with a kitchen. Or was it just 3 rooms? But I remember it was very big. But Irene went, because I told her where it was, and took a photograph of it. And there was this tiny little shack almost, very, very small.
And typical of what you see through adult eyes compared to what you see
That's
through
right,
child's
yes,
eyes.
through child's eyes. So, our points of view were different.
And you talk about the understandable lack of continuity and narrative, but what are the flashes that you do particularly?
Yeah, well, we were sitting in a house, and the Germans were using Stuka bombers to systematically destroy house after house after house, and they'd come over in a flight of 3 and destroy 3 houses on one side. So that gave you notice that you had to move 6 houses along. So I remember and you couldn't walk above ground. So the partisans would make holes in between the cellars so that people could walk through from one house to another to another.
So your life was subterranean.
So in a lot of the time it was subterranean. And there was one point where, it must have been towards the end, when there was a shortage of food, because there was partisans digging out slits in the walls of this subterranean cellar. And so they were making a strong point. But they had a table, and on the table they'd poured some sugar. And as you went past, you were allowed to lick your finger and put it in this sugar and have a suck of sugar, because that was the food that was. And that really struck me. And I knew that they were making a last stand. And I don't know why I thought they were making a last stand. I just knew. And that was life in the cellars. There was a huge shortage of water. And there was an old lady sitting there, and she had some dried rusks. And if you went across the road to a standing tap, you got a dry rusk for a bucket of water. And so my mother went across and brought back 2 buckets, and we got 2 rusks. And we were starving. And so I ate my rusk, and she said, "Are you still hungry?" And I said, "Yes." So she gave me her rusk. And then she stood up and went and got another bucket and went across the road to get some more water. Trouble was, huge sense of guilt that I knew that I was putting her life at risk by taking her rusk, but I was so hungry I couldn't stop myself. Well, I suppose I could have, but at that point I didn't. And the sun was right. Not the sun was right. The light was. The reason you had to run across that road was because it was under fire from the Germans, and that's why there was you got some food for bringing some water across. And the light was increasing, and yet I still wanted that rusk, even though I was putting my mother in danger. So,
when you did go above ground, what did the streets, and we talked about the Stukas and the bombing and the danger and the shooting, what did the streets look like?
Well, there was a film called The Pianist, which showed you these bombed there were still more houses then standing, because the Germans systematically dynamited the whole town after the uprising. Apparently the only towns which were more devastated than Warsaw were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that was systematic demolition after the population left. So, there were blown out windows, doors hanging on hinges. Devastation, really.
I can picture the scene from The Pianist of really rubble-strewn streets.
The rubble was in the streets. Part of it was because of the partisans were building, what are these defences called, where you build barricades, because behind a barricade you couldn't be shot at. So there were barricades everywhere. And I remember we were crossing this big square in the middle of the night. And the biggest building in Warsaw was the Prudential building, which I think had 24 stories high. It was called a skyscraper. And this was burning somewhere in the background, at the very far end of this square, or at a distance. But you could hear the crackling of the fire still, because the whole building was going. And we were walking beneath this low barricade, so my mother had to bend double, and I could just pop my head over the top of it. And as we were going along, the machine gun started firing. So and all these bullets were going shh, shh. So I stopped, and they were so beautiful because they would start off rising slowly, because they had these coloured bullets with tracers, yes, and the bullets would rise very slowly in a parabola, and then at the top of the parabola they would vanish. And I was just amazed how beautiful it was. My mother grabbed me by the collar and would drag me down. And it was just, but that was real beauty. But I seem to jump because I remember quite a lot of things. You asked what things were. One night we were passing a burnt-out tank, and out of the front turret for the driver's seat, there was a head popping out. But the head was popping out, but there were hands. But the hand was like a smooth ball with no fingers. And I remember desperately trying to work out where his fingers had gone. And I don't know whether he'd swollen up and because they'd been burnt off or whatever, but there was just this stump of a hand. And the head was just a smooth ball. And I want to stop and work things out why they were like that. But I couldn't. At the beginning of the Germans had taken over an elegant block of flats. And the block of flats was 3-4 stories or 5 stories high. And we went into this, and there was the ultimate luxury in this flat. There was a fridge. I think none of us had really, I don't know about my parents, I'd certainly never seen a fridge before. But in the fridge, the Germans had moved out so quickly, they'd left some liver. And mother had an onion, or babcia, my grandmother had an onion. And there was no electricity as such, but we had chopped liver and onion. And I was made to eat it, but it tasted awful. So...
even before you got to school?
Yeah. And they had a celebratory mass in the square in the middle of this quadrangle. So we leaned out the windows and were looking down at this celebration of mass. But they had people on the roof looking out for the next flight of Stukas or German planes. Eventually, the Polish Air Force from Italy flew these giant American bombers, which could just about reach Warsaw and drop their load and then go back to Italy, because Stalin wouldn't allow flights to land and refuel in Russian-occupied areas of Russia, or any he would not allow any help to go to the poles. So they flew from Italy and returned but what they carried was Sten guns and bazookas for the Polish partisans. But the Germans were putting on their torches and their lights, so an awful lot of these drops of supplies ended up in German hands. But I remember the searchlights going and looking for these planes, and they would cross and there'd be a plane in the middle, and the planes would release their load, and there'd be these beautiful parachutes and just floating in the sky, just slowly coming down. They're gorgeous. Never saw what they contained, but that's another story. Not another story, just no story. We suppose the worst part of it all was we found ourselves. Anna discovered where the meat market was, where the ancient market was. It's on maps of Warsaw.
This is Anna, who went back to Poland.
Yes,
right?
My sister.
Yeah.
Because we went into, found shelter in this underground market. And there were arches. And these arches were separated by slats of wood so that each merchant had his own little cubbyhole underground to store his provisions or whatever. And there were no provisions there, but it was a lovely place to take shelter. So we had one of these small cubby holes, and there was my mother slept at the far end, then me, then Regina, then her son, and then Grandma right at the door. And Mark was in this main throughway, and I was standing in the door, and there was a huge blast. And then I don't really remember anything, but by some miracle I found myself lying next to my mother. My grandmother, they only identified by her wedding ring after the war. Mark's body was never found. And we, I think, were buried for about 72 hours before they dug us out. And that's where my horror of dehydration comes from.
So what do you remember about that experience,
well,
the 72 hours?
I remember coming awake, and they started pouring, the partisans were trying to dig us out. And I remember the first bits of light coming through. And just above me there was a broken beam, which every time they dug would shift a little bit downwards. And I was completely stuck in this position, because when you're buried, and you can't move right, left or centre. But my mother could move a hand, and she put it on my chest between me and this jagged beam. And then they started pouring water down, because we were so, someone had the good idea, but there was some stuff called carbide, and this started releasing carbide fumes. So people started screaming, don't pour water down because it's reacting with the carbide. Anyway, we lay there for quite some time, and the light grew a bit stronger. And eventually I was the first one to be pulled out. And I remember these tall men standing in a circle around this small hole, pulled me out. And I was asking, where's my mother, and I was running between their legs. and someone was trying to grab hold of me, and I wouldn't because I was waiting for my mother to come out. And they did pull her out, and by some miracle, she was intact, as intact as I was. Anyway, this partisan took her by the hand and put me on his shoulders, and we went through all this rubble and chaos to this courtyard it built. Warsaw had a lot of buildings which had courtyards in it. And we were in the middle of this courtyard, and there's a whoom, thump noise, but really huge. And he sort of started running as if, he was an Olympic sprinter for the next gate. And the windows in this building also bent in and bent out, and then started falling. And he was obviously terrified that we'd be cut to pieces by falling glass. But we got into this large gateway, which was so big enough to take a horse and cart or a horse-drawn taxi or something, or lorry even. And we sort of peeped around the corner. And there was bright sunshine and clouds of debris rushing towards us. You've seen films of 7/11, not with these clouds of dust. Well, that dust like that, just rushing at you, but looking beautiful. But on top of all this dust, there were books. There were flying books. And some were red, and some were gold, and some were green, and some were greys and browns. And as they flew up into the air, they would open up and parachute down. It was just beautiful. And then we got covered in dust. But that was just magic. And I suppose my obsession with holding on to books has been ever since that moment. But after the Warsaw uprising, we learned the Germans had brought up one of their large 16-inch Krupp guns, and they were railway guns. And they were sending these gigantic missiles over onto Warsaw, which would destroy a block of flats or whatever they hit. And apparently this one had hit one of the central libraries. After the war, there were rumours at the time, but the official version of why this market was destroyed was that a bomb had fallen into the cellars. In fact, what had really happened was that some partisans had got hold of an unexploded bomb and were steaming the lignite out of it. And it was booby-trapped, so it's exploded and killed us all. Our grandmother died, as I said. Mark was never found. Nothing of Mark was ever found. And my aunt's leg was shattered. We eventually got to where some field station where we caught up with Irena, my aunt, and she was in plaster from this leg, and we got some watery tomato soup, or soup, whatever it was. It looked like tomato, but it was so awful I could barely eat it, though we were starving. But that was the only food that was.
Did you have, from the explosion, did you have any injuries?
None at all.
Did your mum have any injuries?
None.
So I remember you mentioning that just moments ago you mentioned about the wood
the
pushing.
beam. Yeah. No, not a scratch.
She moved her
hand to protect me against it.
Yeah.
It didn't scratch her. It was above.
It was just...
Yeah. Anyway, after that, we were mother was doing some dental work, and we were in the first floor of a building, which was a field station. But most of the people there, well, the people that I remember were all in these. In those days, plasters were incredibly heavyweight. There were no light plasters, all plasters seemed to weigh a ton. So when you had your leg in plaster, you couldn't move, and you were too heavy to be moved. And because this building was jutting out in this square, the Germans had surrounded it. And I remember, I don't know whether I'm conflating two sets of laughter, but I remember laughter. And they started throwing phosphorus grenades through the windows of this field station. And the people there screaming. And my mother grabbing me by my arm and running. And I couldn't do anything to help these people.
Were these people in beds? Or?
In beds, yes. Well, they were lying in beds with these smashed up limbs.
Yeah.
And there was no way to help them. But the partisans had dynamited another building so that it collapsed onto this field station. So we had like a sort of barricade from the first floor down to the ground level, and we slid down this barricade. I don't remember anything after that, except that, first that there was no way out for these people. But we got out, and I felt huge guilt. I suppose that's the strange things, sort of, why are you alive? And, Mark was such a nice bloke. Why was he dead and why was I alive? I'm a miserable old git, and he was so lovely, and, didn't seem to make sense or rhyme or reason. And then sort of endless periods of moving in the dark behind barricades. I don't think we ever went into proper sewers, but we certainly moved through very dank and damp and smelly underground, presumably cellars. And the hunger. At the very end, when the partisans surrendered, Mother and I found ourselves with this pianist who was totally different from the pianist. But he was a man who was obsessed by his canary, and he had a hoard of what's the stuff that canaries eat? Canary food.
Some sort of seeds, maybe. Yeah.
And one wasn't allowed to take canaries out of Warsaw. So he opened the windows and scattered this food all over the piano. And said, well, I hope the canary finds its way south, but if it can't, at least it can come back and eat the food off the piano. And we lost him. All the civilians were made to walk out of Warsaw. So we were staggering under our bundles. My mother had some sort of suitcase, and I had a little suitcase and my school satchel. And we were walking along and stopping because everything was too heavy. And along the side of the path, because people had been leaving Warsaw, there were all these broken down prams. And for once in my life, I said, "Look, Mum, there's a pram which is not broken." And she said, "They're all broken, son." Anyway, I rushed off to the side, and her shouting, "Don't," because there were unexploded mines and things everywhere. And I grabbed this thing, and it was a pram with actually 4 wheels on it. So we were able to put our bundles on that. And trundled on and on and on until we left Warsaw behind us. And we were walking along, and there was an intact railway line. And on this railway line moved a 2-carriage train. And it was miles ahead of us, so we thought when it had stopped, and we thought, "Oh, well, we'll never catch it," but we ran and ran. And he waited for us. So we got on the train with our bundles, and that took us some way away from Warsaw. And by some miracle, it was going in the direction of where my mother's aunt had her farm. So we eventually got to her farm. Even if it was after Warsaw, our intentions had been fulfilled. We got there. And I saw how a pig is slaughtered. And
was that a huge feeling of relief? It must have been.
Oh, to get to her place was beautiful. Yes, we stayed there for a while, but you can't live off other people's charity because no one had any food. And she was a dentist, and she found there was a convent which had a dental surgery inside it. So she went to practice dentistry there, and she must have had her pedal machine, which is now in my garden, my garage.
Is that the pedal drill?
Drill,
if you like.
yes, yeah. And she must have. I retrieved it at some point, because she certainly didn't have it with her when we were in the cellars and were blown up. But anyway, she had this, and she always said she'd kept it throughout the war. So perhaps she'd left it behind in grandfather's house, because I can't remember her carrying a pedalled drill in Warsaw itself. So she might have got it back after the uprising. Anyway, it was very useful because there was no electricity for Poles most of the time. And suddenly, when there was, it was only for a couple of hours, and then it would stop. And
so how long did you stay on the farm for?
Well, we stayed till, must have been till the beginning of November, because we found in this cottage that there was this woman whose husband had gone to war, and my mother and her lived in this, but very soon after we moved there, the snows came. And she had to walk through the snows up the hill to the convent where she did her drilling. And that snow was really getting thicker and thicker, and when you walked in it went crump. And the trees started cracking. Even though they had no sap in them, they were bursting. with the snow, with the cold. And you stay there for Christmas. That would have been the Christmas of 44. And that's my best Christmas story ever, because the snow became more and more packed, but rose and rose. So when you opened the front door, you went through a corridor between piles of snow. And it was the night of Christmas Eve. It must have been Christmas Eve, because suddenly there was this huge rumble of noise, and there was these giant tanks suddenly arrived, and these men in white uniform jumped out of the tanks, and they were Germans, and they went into the house, and it couldn't have been Christmas Eve because that must have been the following night, and they my mother had made some sort of small Christmas tree. So they sang Christmas carols round the tree. And I think Holy Night is the same in practically every language, because I remember being able to join in one song, Chicanots. Anyway, one of these Germans said, "And what are you getting for Christmas?" And I said, "Nothing." So he came back with a soft bit of plank and carved me a dog. A very simple dog, just a head and one leg from both sides and a stub of a tail. And he said, "There you are, there's your Christmas present." So I got a dog for Christmas. Anyway, we go to sleep, and suddenly there's a noise of, and a rumble, and all these huge creaking machines disappear. And I'm left with the tree and mother and this woman and the dog. And then there's another set of rumbling, creaking, grinding, groaning machines arrive. And again, because the snow was so packed, when you looked up, you saw the wheels of the tank, but not the turret or the gun, because they were out of sight, because they were so high above you, or above me anyway. And these were Russians. And I'm sitting there with this dog, and they said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's my Christmas present, my dog." They must have known some Polish. Perhaps there were some Poles in the Russian army, because I remember talking in Polish. And they said, "Who made it for you?" I said, "The Germans made it for me yesterday when they were here." So he looked at it and said, "Well, a decent dog needs to be painted." I said, "Yes, my dog was white with spots on." He said, "Hold on." So he went back to his tank and he got some white camouflage paint and painted my dog, and then got some black grease and made spots on it and gave it an eye. And from somewhere they managed to find 2 spindles which they put through the foot with a small wheel on it. So my dog was given mobility. I was so pleased. And that was fun. And they didn't, they didn't yell, they didn't shout. "Oh yes," they said, "What have you got for Christmas?" And they had a small piece of black bread. And you had to show it to them because, you couldn't really hide. So they said, "Well, we can do one better." And they went back to the tank and got some pickled herrings. They're pickled in salt. So we had it's traditional, as you've noticed, the Polish Christmas. There's always herring with a little bit of onion. I don't think we had olive oil, but we had herring with onion on black bread. So there we are. That was Christmas. Still brings tears to my eyes. So there we go.
Who was there that Christmas with you? With just your mum?
The lady whose house it was,
Yeah.
and me. And they were obviously terrified of being raped or seduced or whatever by. And
when the Germans had attended the day before,
they were completely exhausted. In fact, all these soldiers were just, falling asleep on their legs.
But they were, to your mind, and certainly to the Allies' mind, the enemy.
Yeah, they were. And I couldn't cope with the fact that they thought that a kid needed a present at Christmas.
Yeah.
So
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm getting hysterical in my old age. I used to be able to tell this story without crying, but now I find it very difficult. Anyway, after that, we moved to my father's family in Dombek, where they still live. And they, fed us and looked after us, and we stayed there, I think, for quite a while. Eventually, we were driven to the next village where there was a carter who had two beautiful, huge, big horses, and he was driving into Warsaw. And so he put us on top of his pile of stuff he had, with a little bit of stuff we had, and we drove into Warsaw. And he had three, these were quite wide wagons, so there was plenty of room on the front seat for him and the two of us. And that's when, clip-clopping into Warsaw, that's the time when I remember the total shocking sight of the town being utterly, utterly destroyed, like in the film The Pianist, with just the occasional wall standing with a window in it or a half window, and the roads just completely full of rubble. So there were just narrow gauge, one-way gauge with passing points, so that things could get through. And we got to and the bridges had been blown, so they'd built a bridge of barges with a plank roadway on top. But the river was still with lots of huge lumps of ice in it, and was running its spate. And we were going. We were crossing the river, and this whole bridge was moving up and down. And in the middle of the river, the horses started to panic and rear. And this carter sort of jumped up. There's so little space, but he jumped off the cart, rushed to the front and grabbed his horses and calmed them down. And we were terrified we'd all end up in the river. But, he was just, and then he led them across the river. And that's how we went to grandfather's house. When we left, grandfather had refused to move with us because he'd built this house and this is where he lived, and there was no way that no Russian or anyone else or German was going to move him or even any uprising. So he stayed, and I remember the last sight of him sitting with a glass of vodka, his hand in his head like this, and we're all leaving, and he doesn't say goodbye, he's just sitting there like that. Anyway, we all go off, and he's sitting there. We open the door, and we're his grandfather, sitting just like that.
As if nothing had changed?
Nothing had changed.
What was his name?
Kraszka, Jan Kraszka. I'm desperately trying to remember my grandmother's name, and I can't, but Anne's got it. Mm. But I think the other one was called Polonia. Perhaps she was called Polonia. Anyway, one of my grandmothers was called Polonia. That's all the exciting bits.
Shall I stop there for a moment and get some... So you got back and seen exactly the same expression that you'd seen when you left.
When I left, yeah.
So what happened after? How long did you remain in Poland after that?
Well, what happened after that was I don't know how long we remained in Poland after that. It was 44, 45. 45, 46, I think. Yes, we'd have left Poland in 46.
And what was the reason for leaving Poland? How did that all come about?
The Polish, the communists, when they came into Poland, set up a communist government for Poland with communist an army called Bering's Army, which is a Polish-Russian army, and very quickly established a police force and all the other things. And part of the doing, because they established a unit like MI5, and one of their jobs was to fish out anyone who'd been a partisan in the Second World War. As they assumed that they weren't communists, they assumed they were all capitalists. So they became very interested in Mother because there she had been sitting quietly doing dentistry in a civilian sort of way. Then suddenly the Second World War starts. Madam takes herself into central Warsaw and stays there till the end. So who except someone who's working for the Polish underground would want to be in Warsaw? And the more she denied that she had anything to do with the underground, of course that's made them more interested.
This is your mother?
My mother, yes. Mother Wanda. So what happened was, because at this point the Polish government in Great Britain has obviously a secret service in Poland, and the Polish underground, which they run from London, it was 10,000 strong. So, the Russians had a big job trying to fish all these people out. And I think in that they were eventually helped by that gang of murderous bastards called Burgess MacLean, who people now think of as, dirty little men. But what they were was they took lists of partisans and very gaily handed them over to the Russians, who gaily either sent them to prison or shot them. So my mother's being interviewed by the Secret Service, at which two well-dressed gentlemen arrive at her house and ask to speak to Wanda Kessling. And they say, we're representatives of your husband, and on a given date, if you wish to go to join him in Italy, where he is now, you can you on a given date. You will meet us in Krakow, and then from Krakow you will be picked up, and through Czechoslovakia you will travel to Nuremberg, and Nuremberg you will go with a Polish army transport across the Alps into Italy. Oh, and by the way, we'll give you false passports for the border. So our transit across borders was not as difficult as a lot of other people, because we did go to Warsaw, but the transport, we went from Warsaw to Krakow, and in Krakow, across the square, I actually saw the man in those days. He used to walk across the square, the trumpeter, who plays a Polish piece of music called the Haynau. And the myth is it was started in the 12th century when the Tatars attacked Poland, and the trumpeter in the tower blows his trumpet, then an arrow hits him. He stops, and another trumpeter immediately picks up the trumpet. So the Haynau is played at midday. It's like the BBC playing boom, 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 boom. But they play the half, then there's a break, and then it carries on. Now, whether that's carried from the 12th century is a moot point, but it's certainly the little chap who plays the trumpet, certainly this is 1946, remember, wore a fireman's hat, a brass hat, and had a long black cloak, and in his hand he carried his trumpet swinging. And that's a memory. In fact, I did a drawing of it because it's such a strong memory of that man. And anyway, from Krakow we went, and I knew we were leaving Poland for this, when our second trip to Krakow. So I said goodbye to every tree, every house, because I wasn't going to see them again.
Who were the men that had come to see?
There were two Secret Service agents from the London branch of the Polish government. In other words, the pro-capitalists. Anyway, they furnished us with passports.
You said goodbye to is there every house, every tree?
Yeah, that's on the train going to Krakow. And then in Krakow, we got into these huge lorries.
With lots of other people?
With lots of other people. And they drove across the border. It was a big smuggling racket of some sort or other. But it was must have been of much use to the Polish Secret Service. Anyway, we drove to across the border into Czechoslovakia, where we were picked up by train. And I can't remember whether the train stopped in Prague or Pilsen or wherever, but my mother said they were selling beer in frothing glasses. And my mother said, "Julius, you've got to try this. This is the best beer in the world. Try the horrible muck. It was awful."
But then you were only 5?
Liberated, yeah. No, I was 5.
Yeah.
Just
5.
Yes,
Yeah.
I came 5 in July. No, I must have been 6. Yeah. Anyway.
But that was your first taste of beer.
Taste of Czechoslovakian beer. Put me off for life, as you well know. And nothing else really happened until we reached Nuremberg. And I can't remember. And we went into this house surrounded by a wall. It was a grey house with a grey wall. And the place smelled of urine. And so we went into this room where we were allocated. We lay down, and I suppose all the children were in the same boat, because suddenly I complained in the night because there's the stuff dripping on my head. And the drips used to be from the first floor to the second to the third. So the new ones always got the bottom floor. But we luckily stayed only there one night because the next day my father arrived, which was a total shock.
Where had he come from?
He'd come over from Italy, driven over the Alps with one of these convoys. The official reason for the convoys was that there were Polish prisoners of war and Gastbiters in Germany. A Gastbiter is someone who's forced to go to work on the land or factory, but is not military and is not a POW, and is just forced labour, for which they didn't get paid. But that's neither here nor there. So these convoys went over officially only for the army soldiers, the prisoners of war, and they were given a choice. They said, you can come to Italy and join the army there, or you can go back to Poland. But remember what happens to some of if you've heard the stories about what happens to the Russians who were sent back to Poland, a lot were shot. And why should your choice be different? So a lot of them chose to go to Italy. Because my father had the benefit of a Russian prisoner of war camp, he was very able to tell about the joys of Mother Russia and what waited you if they got their hands on you. So we arrived there. The place is horrible and dank. I found a German machine pistol. And by dint of skills I know not where from, I managed to actually get it to some level of functioning. I don't think it shot anything, but the myth I developed around it was that suddenly 3 heads appeared on a wall, and I pointed the gun at them and went da 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 with my mouth, and the gun started jerking off and shooting bullets in all directions.
So where did you find this pistol?
It was in the grounds of this place where the bunks were in 3 tiers. So anyway, we arrived, and the next day we're travelling. We're put into open lorries, but with a canvas hood on. And Father, being an officer and gentleman, sits in the front with the driver, and we sit. And at the end of the lorry, there's a soldier with a gun. Because they were frightened of bandits. And we drove into the Alps and crossed through the Alps into Italy. And for the first time I saw the Mediterranean, somewhere between Venice and Trieste, but it wasn't Italy.
What time of year was this? Do you recall?
No.
What was it like seeing the sea?
The sea was disappointing. It had it's Adriatic, so it's practically tideless. So these tiny little waves. I thought that waves would be at least 3-4 feet high, and it was the sky was grey with cloud, and the sea was grey, and it was a sort of gravelly beach which was dirty, but not dirty because of people sitting there. It was dirty because of all the scum of war.
Yeah.
So there was nothing really exciting about it. The journey was made exciting because when we were leaving the town, this horde of children appeared and started chasing the lorry. And I became quite excited and wanted them to drive faster so they wouldn't catch up with us, because these lorries were grunging. Anyway, this chap with his gun, protecting us against Germans of all sizes and types, instead of pointing his rifle at them, goes into his kit bag and finds some biscuits and starts throwing to the kids, who in delight, And so I say to him, "Why are you encouraging them?" And I said, "Why are you encouraging them? They're Germans. Why give them food? They're Germans." And he said, "Did you have breakfast this morning?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "So Why did you have breakfast this morning? And I said, yes. And what about, and she said, look at those children. They haven't eaten anything. And instead of thinking, my God, that's a lesson in morality and what a good man he is and what a little shit am I thought, you little bastard of him. Don't you, you haven't really had to deal with proper Germans, have you? It took me years to realise that those Christmas soldiers who carved dogs and painted them, they were just tired, exhausted men. And I sort of almost kept them in a separate bubble, you know. Mm. There were the rest of the Germans, and there were these people who carved dogs. Mm. But for years after the war, I refused to listen to any German music. And one day I suddenly realised I was but that included Austrians, and I realised I deprived myself of Mozart and Schubert for years and years and years. Tragic.
So you then arrived in England?
No, we then arrived in Italy.
In Italy?
Yeah.
Whereabouts in Italy?
Where the Mediterranean hits somewhere between.
That's where you'd actually stopped. Okay.
That's where the lorries stopped on Thingbob.
Right.
Eventually, I can't remember the mode of transportation. We arrived in Ancona. Ancona is more or less opposite Rome on the Mediterranean side, and that was the main. That's where the Polish staff stayed. And so my father's office was in Ancona, and he had an apartment in Ancona. And he had a batman called Mr. Conish, who was lovely, and who would take me to see war films.
And Mr. Conish was who?
My father's batman.
Oh, okay.
And
what was your dad at that stage? What was his?
I think he was a captain.
Right.
The Polish army was top-heavy with generals and majors, and so no matter what your position was, you kept your rank. So he was, by that time, assistant inspector of hospitals, or assistant inspector of hospitals. But he was still a captain. But when he came over as a major. But yes, but it meant he got a captain's pay rather.
Yeah. And for how long did you remain in Italy?
Months and months and months. It felt like a year almost. Time enough for me to battle with the local Italian kids. And we called them Germans, and they'd call us Tedeschi, which is also German. Germania Tedeschi.
And did you? And so after however many months,
we spent the whole summer in Italy.
Yeah. And
father had leave because being Polish and heroic, he hadn't had any holiday time. So we got a large Humber with what's the kind with wood on the back, wooden slats on the back of a car.
Like a sort of, I can only think of a Morris Minor Traveller.
Yes, it's like exactly, but a Humber Traveller.
Yeah.
And we had a chauffeur, and very impressively, he had a pistol. Yes,
the chauffeur had a pistol?
Yes. Well, he was army chauffeur. And again, it was bandit country, remember, everywhere. So all the army people carried either sidearms or army pistols. Europe was a strange place at that time.
Yeah.
And anyway, we travelled down as far as Naples and saw Pompeii. And in those days they were very strict. They wouldn't allow little boys into the brothel, where all the good pictures are. So I was kept outside, which was very disappointing. And then from there we went to Rome and obviously did the Vatican. And from there we went to Florence and saw the Uffizi in all its glory, or what was there of the Uffizi at that time. And from there we went to Milano and saw the cathedral, and we saw an awful lot of art. It was like as if my father was giving me an art education in Renaissance art. But, it was grist to the mill. I loved every minute of it.
And that was a lifelong passion?
Well, it was start off. I remember in the war I hadn't seen anything like that ever. And then from Milan we went to Venice, and Venice was a strange place because there was the British fleet in the harbour outside, and on the landward side where the train came in, there was a large lagers of Polish tanks. The Polish tank division in all its glory was in Venice at that time. And they had planned to go to join Peyton, who by that time was in Czechoslovakia. But the British had decided that for every tank they would send only one lorry full of petrol after it, and one set of 20 bullets per tank or something like that. So they stopped the Polish tanks going off to join Peyton and then into southern Poland. And the reason for that was because in 1942 Poland had been signed away to the Germans. These men just carried on fighting. But there was nearly a revolution at that point. Anyway, from there we came back to Genoa. I don't want to say Genoa. I can't remember us going to Genoa. Anyway, we went from Venice back to central Italy, and we stayed there till it was time to come to England. And then we got on a train, and which chuffed its way right through Europe. Oh, exciting bit. Half the train rolled back into Italy when it was climbing into the Swiss mountains.
But it broke. The coupling
broke. Yes, the coupling unbuckled. So we had to wait for it to be pushed back out. We had to chug down, and they had to be pushed up, and we met and chugged on.
And this journey was, I don't know what sort of period of time after you arrived in
2 or 3 days.
But the leaving for England was what, after 6 months in Italy, or
6 or 7 months, because we must have gone there in early spring.
Yeah. And
we left in September, October.
Right. And so 2 or 3 days travelling by train to Calais, I think was an open port then. Certainly, I don't recall Dieppe is different, so it would have been Calais. Why did you? What before I ask you about arriving in England? Why had the choice, or were you aware of why the choice of going to England had been made rather than any other country?
Well, the choices they had was USA, Argentina, or England, and they had relatives in USA, so that would have been the logical. That's what my mother wanted to do. Father, for some strange reason, fancied Argentina, but he decided to stay in England, because he felt they'd started something called the Polish Resettlement Corps, so he felt sort of moral obligation to find jobs for all his doctors. And to be fair, it was fairly easy because there was a huge shortage of doctors in England at that time. But anyway, so he felt that, and also they all thought that if Stalin dropped dead, there would be a chance to get back into Poland, and they thought that the peace between the Poles and the Russians, the border, the Iron Curtain, that wouldn't stand more than a 1 or 2 years chance. And then they thought that Polish divisions, so they all stayed. A lot of them stayed in England because they were ready for the re-invasion of Poland in 49-50 at the latest.
Yeah. So what were your... do you remember getting onto the ferry?
No, but I remember being on the ferry because the ferry, suddenly among the clouds, there was bright sunlight and the sea turned bright, bright green.
Mm.
And, the Mediterranean is either blue or this sort of pulsating green, but this was a vibrant, daylight, luminous green in this yellow light. And in the middle of it were three porpoises just straight in front of the boat. Because, of course, the fishing was being so limited. The channel must have been full of fish at that time. So there were these porpoises in front of sailing on the bow wave of the ferry.
And do you remember your arrival?
Yes, suddenly the ship went into fog. And it did. And you couldn't see a thing because everywhere was fog. And we arrived at this house where we were being quartered, which was in fog. And you open the door and the stairs are sort of foggy yellow. The colour is foggy yellow of the stairs, down the middle of which is a very narrow red runner. So you've got foggy yellow everywhere. And must have been pre-Second World War white paint, which had gone yellow, But as far as I was concerned, everything was foggy yellow.
This is in Dover, was it?
This is in Dover. The next day, we go down for breakfast and we're given a special treat. I look forward to it and think, oh, yummy, jam. And I take some and put it on my piece of bread. I'd never tasted anything so awful in my life. It was bitter. It was tasted of oranges. And it was marmalade. You expect me to love this country forever.
But you love it now.
Oh, totally. I'm so obsessed with marmalade that one year I took it on holiday with me.
And you moved to, as a family, there's the three of you now.
Mm-hmm.
You'd moved to London?
No, there was the two of us arrived in England and Father had to shut down the hospitals in Italy before he came over.
Oh, I see.
So we didn't move to London. We went to an English resettlement camp, which was, again, but this time there were beds in rather than bunks.
Where was this?
In somewhere Spudley or Dudley or name like that.
Dudley Salterton, something like that.
Alverton, Salterton, wherever.
Yeah.
But Dudley.
Surbiton.
Could have been
something
Surbiton.
like that.
Yes,
yeah.
One of those.
Yeah.
But those camps, in fact, were scattered all over England. And there were obviously ex-army camps. There'd been so many Americans and other nations here. So they had room to put us all up. And we stayed there till... we must have been over there over Christmas because I remember being in the Nativity play as one of the shepherds. And I was very miffed I wasn't an angel or anything proper. And I said, but never mind, Julius, you're the head shepherd, which mollified my angst. So
another good Christmas.
Another good Christmas. After that, we did move to London, and we had I suppose a grace and favour. No, it must. I called it grace and favour, but it's not really because there was a woman in charge of it, and storekeeper, God knows what she was.
Where was it?
In Cromwell Road, because Father was working in a hotel called the Rembrandt, which is opposite the V&A.
So he'd come back and joined you by this stage?
Yes, he'd come back.
Okay.
When he came back, he got a army quarters in London because he was on the staff. And so we were able to move into army quarters. But I went to they sent me to a local school called Virgo Fidelis. In the class, mind you, this is my explanation of my behaviour. I hated England and I wanted to go back to grandfather in Poland. I didn't hate England, I just felt I was totally out of place. They speak this strange language which I don't understand. They haven't bothered to learn Polish. I mean, what is this? And but I did like the guards in their uniforms, because in Hyde Park they would play on a Sunday, and that was another story. But anyway, we moved into these quarters, and I went to the local school, and the local school was full of girls, run by nuns, and I'm sure it was called Virgo Fidelis. Anyway, I used to go in there, and the first thing I'd do is lift my hand up and say, "Please, miss, can I go to the lavatory?" I'd go to the lavatory, lock myself in, and refuse to be cajoled out till the end of school. Or it felt like the end of school, whether it was or not. But anyway, I did this on a regular basis, and 6 months managed magnificently to learn, "Please, miss, can I go to the lavatory?" and very little else. Made no friends. So they decided that the best thing for me was boarding school. A nice intellectual approach. I promised myself that I would never send you to boarding school after my experience in boarding school. And there you are. What do? First thing possible, send you off to boarding school. But
and so you went to boarding school?
So I went to boarding school.
Which was where?
It was a dame school in Margate. It seemed to be a feeder school for... I can't remember, but for some local prep school. And so I stayed in this feeder school in Margate for the year, and then came back to London.
How was the year?
Horrible, absolutely horrible. We used to live in little dorms with a tiny fire, and the matron would leave it on when we were getting undressed, but then come in and switch it off. So there were 2 beds which were precious, the ones nearest the fire, and the 3 other beds were the furthest away from the bed was, of course, Charlie Muggins, who couldn't speak the language. And if I tried to move, I noticed they were going in a circle, so I thought, well, I'll join the circle. So they all sat on me, night after night after night after night after night, until I knew my place. And, there was strange. I thought, right, maths will come along and at least I'll understand that. And they start off, but at that time in England they didn't use base 10 as a way in a logarithmic way. They had another way of using base 10. So by 9 and carry 1s and all this rubbish rather, So I just got. Thought another lesson in German. Don't understand anything of it. But there were some blokes who were day boys who was nice. There was one bloke with a magnificent train set who used to invite me out for tea on a Sunday, which was lovely. It was a break from school, and when I first went to school, my father showed me where the Catholic Church in this town was. Between Margate and Ramsgate, I had the name. Anyway, Anna has it somewhere because I told her this. And he showed me where the church was. So come Sunday, I get up, put my clothes on and wander off to church. But of course I had no way of telling anybody where I was going. So they had half the village out looking for me. And I'm coming out of church, and one of the young teachers was a priest, was a Catholic, and he's going in the other direction and suddenly recognises me coming out of church. So he takes me by the hand and leads me back to the school. Where did he go? He went, "How did you know where the Catholic Church was?" So there we are.
So you stayed at the boarding school for that academic year, and what happened at the end of that?
Came back to London.
Back to Cromwell Road?
No. By that time, my parents had moved to Tooting, Hilbury Road. No, it wasn't. Anyway, number 12 Hilbury Road, it should be.
Right, okay.
Or was that? No, that was their next house. Anyway, I've forgotten where it was. On the edge of Tooting Common. Lovely, huge, great house. And he had a half share in it. So my mother was working as a dentist in central London, a road called Bulstrode Street. And anyway, somewhere near to where her hairdresser worked, with whom she joined then, never left. She was in her 80s. Till death parted them, I think.
Mm. And you ended up at Malwood Road.
Yeah. Well,
was that after the Hilbury Road?
That's right. We parents sold that, bought Malwood Road, and that was about 49.
And that was where your mum worked as a dentist in the front portion of the house.
That's right. And
Your
father worked as a doctor in the back portion.
GP in the back portion.
That's right.
And which, after time, you eventually came to own that house.
Yeah.
And that there's an awful lot, obviously, that goes on. I wanted to concentrate on the war, but
Polish bit. Yeah.
really, you went to school opposite Mel,
Clapham College.
Clapham College, and that wasn't the greatest experience. Certainly, initially, was it?
Well, by that time, I knew English, so
Yeah.
But the friends I made there, I still got.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't like school because I was the dunce of the class. Because if you're dyslexic, you're a dunce. So that's what it was in those days. So why should you, how can you like school? It's an agony.
But you, notwithstanding dyslexia, you ended up studying medicine.
Yeah, because I'm bloody minded. And sorry. Yes, I think I was, I've always said, I always want to do art, and my father says that, do medicine and I'll pay for your education. Do art and I won't, and I didn't want the thought of starving was not a good idea. And at that time, I didn't think I'd get any sort of scholarship or award.
But you were at St Andrews?
But I got into St Andrews.
Yeah.
And,
that's where you met my mum?
And that's where
Sheila.
I met your mum.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then bizarrely ended up back in Dover, where I was born.
That's right.
In 1966.
Yeah.
And Paul, my elder brother, born in Scotland.
In Dundee.
In Dundee.
Mm. And you're a man of Kent rather than a Kentish man.
I want to show you something that you gave me a while ago. And I just want you to explain what this is. So it's in the bottom of my... And it's this link. It's a chain link. It's got 3 links to it.
Yes.
What is that, Dad?
That's what your grandfather... You can record this if you like. If you can.
It's being recorded.
I'll
certainly take a photograph of it. Yeah.
This was your grandfather Václav, when he was in Russia, was walking along the beach of one of these gigantic Russian lakes, and saying, "What's the chance of me seeing my wife? What's my chance of going to see, having a normal human life again?" And he sees these 3 links on the ground, and seeing these chain links, he decides, my God, that's a sign from heaven that I'm going to survive, and my wife's going to survive, and my son's going to survive, and we're all going to get together. And that's the story of the 3 children.
That's that symbol of so many things.
Yeah.
Hope, determination, and that he's going to see his family again.
And the thought of carrying that in your backpack.
I wanted to ask you about it when you were holding it. It's a wonderful thing. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
It's been utterly fascinating, and there's things, many of which I knew, but in some ways I hadn't heard them with the detail that you've explained them today, and it's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure.